was a very calculated effort to drive a deep wedge between Russia and the United States, and particularly on a personal level between Putin and Obama, largely because the potential, as we well know, for a constructive Russian role in dealing with the nuclear issue regarding Iran, which had already resulted in the movement toward the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. The possibility even of Russian cooperation in pressing for some kind of agreement, as far-fetched as that may seem at this moment, regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All those factors, of course, were negated and undermined by the crisis in Ukraine. So that's a very important point to take into account. But not only was there a threat to cooperation between the United States and Russia on issues like Iran, Syria, but there are also aspects of this situation which are absolutely crazy. For example, given the development of tremendous strains in the relationship between East and West, at this particular moment, you have the potential cutting off of energy supplies to Western Europe and the undermining of rest of European economies. Another aspect of this situation pointed out recently by Parry, which is really interesting, is that the threat of additional sanctions being piled on Russia has probably accelerated a process that's been in motion for quite some time, and that is a massive, massive energy agreement between China and Russia, drawing China and Russia closer together. So there are aspects of this thing that at some levels don't seem to make much sense unless one begins to take into account the whole history of NATO movement eastward and movement toward the Ukraine, and particularly NATO's determination, it seems, to embrace Ukraine and draw Ukraine into its orbit. Another aspect of the situation, perhaps not generally understood, but I think it's very fundamental to the crisis at hand at the moment, was the tremendous amount of gunboat diplomacy going on, which was a critical factor in deepening the crisis and bringing it to a near breaking point. For example, at an early stage, even before the events of February 21st, 22nd, when Obama and Putin thought they had an agreement to see to it that the Yanukovych government begins, which was undoubtedly a kleptomania to the nth degree, and had brought about a tremendous amount of deep alienation and dissatisfaction among large portions of Ukrainian society. But nevertheless, there was an agreement that Yanukovych would broaden his government significantly, and not simply window dressing, but substantive changes, bringing opposition elements into key positions within the government, holding a national election in December to bring about a new regime, which Yanukovych presumably would not be a candidate. These issues they thought had been settled, only to have the whole thing overthrown in a day's time by a coup, which, by the way, was technically illegal. People really don't realize it, but the Ukrainian, it was illegal by small degrees, but illegal nevertheless. Something is either legal or illegal, right? According to the Ukrainian constitution, 75% of the parliament has to agree to dismiss a government. 72%, which is still a very large number, agreed to dismiss that government. But in any case, that is a violation of the Ukrainian constitution. And they pushed ahead. They put this new government in. Yanukovych took his pets and his paraphernalia and fled and so on. But at the very same time, something else was going on, which is critically important, and it's something that we have to understand in terms of the general momentum and political design of NATO, and that is gunboat diplomacy. At an early stage, even as the events on the Maidan, the big square in Kiev, were unfolding, the USS Donald Cook, was an Aegis missile-armed destroyer, was threatening the Russian coastline. As a matter of fact, demonstrations had broken out in Odessa particularly, which always had a tradition of being a particularly politically sophisticated and a kind of center of radical thinking going back to Soviet days. That demonstrations had broken out in Odessa protesting the Donald Cook being in international waters, but nevertheless being armed with missiles that could easily reach the coast of Ukraine. That put the Black Sea in general, the Black Sea coastline, inside the Russian strategic survival doctrine. And that almost made, it created a very, very serious situation. As a matter of fact, when the Russians protested, the Donald Cook withdraws temporarily. But it's replaced very quickly by the USS Mount Whitney, which is not a battleship, but is the floating NATO headquarters for strike forces based in Romania and in Hungary. And the thinking at that time was that, and apparently it's been confirmed by various figures in the military establishment, that the purpose of floating this boat near Ukraine was to distract Putin, to make him nervous, and supposedly, believe it or not, disrupt the Olympics going on at the time. It didn't quite work out that way. But shortly thereafter, in April, when events were really beginning to come to a head, guess what reappears in that part of the world? The Donald Cook returns. And not only that, but other ships loaded with anti-missile batteries and the like were appearing. And it became increasingly apparent that Russia would be ousted from the Black Sea with only a small coastline if those missile defenses that Russia had broke down, and there was a rapid movement toward the absorption of Ukraine into NATO. So, part of the picture, and it's something that most people don't realize, the whole question of anti-missile batteries appearing in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov was very much related to the fact that that NATO was continuing to build its so-called ABM defenses along the borders of Russia, through Poland particularly, and the Baltic states. Putin had asked, and this I find really fascinating, Putin had asked the NATO to give him a simple written declaration, stating that those missiles were not aimed at the Russian deterrent at this point, of course. And the United States refused, NATO refused to give that written assurance. At any point, they said, hey, look, all we want is a simple piece of paper. You keep claiming verbally that this panoply of missiles now beginning to surround Russia are not aimed at any kind of aggressive acts toward Russia. The formal position was that these missiles are aimed, these anti-missile systems are aimed at Iran, but there was a refusal on the part of the United States and NATO to make that kind of a statement formally on paper. So that's part of the picture. Missiles, plots, all this sort of stuff going on at the time, which could probably bring to some kind of understanding at a deeper level why the Russians, at a point where, they were trying to integrate, this is not the Soviet Union, and they were trying to integrate a system that was capitalist and oligarchic in many ways into the economic and strategic global texture, so that the fact that there was such aggressive posture toward Russia, particularly in undermining Russia's own nuclear deterrent, This was a factor, I think, that brought about the annexation of Crimea. And the West at this point is clearly forcing a split. France, Poland had agreed, as I indicated before, on February 21st to respect the non-aligned status of Ukraine, which, by the way, would be a potential road to a solution of the Ukraine conflict. That Ukraine could, and a number of people have made this point, Ukraine could easily become analogous to the role that Finland plays in the world, where Finland maintains good relations west and east. It maintains a political neutrality. It doesn't have any foreign armaments on its soil, and it's a kind of vessel of stability in that part of the world. So there are a couple other factors involved here too, namely, even under Yanukovych, who of course is not a paragon of sober integrity, that Yanukovych had been negotiating with Chevron for shale gas extraction contracts in Ukraine. And this is also a serious factor when it became apparent that perhaps these contracts won't be honored, that there was a real danger, I think, in the minds of those who began plotting a coup, that something had to be done. A recent report, by the way, which passed on to me, really interesting, is that Exxon was in the midst of trying to develop massive contracts for the exploration of mineral resources under the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and that the speculation, I think is the proper word, is that those resources perhaps are almost at a level of the resources, the mineral resources, the energy resources that exist in the North Sea. The seizure, interestingly enough, the annexation of Crimea screwed up the whole deal, because according to the law of the sea, with Crimea, Russia now has cut off a major area of the Black Sea from the ownership of Ukraine, and has, you know, as the point that some people have made, that this adventure at this juncture seriously undermined and mitigated the economic interests of the major oil companies in the United States. So let me conclude now, running a little late on this. I want to say a few words about what's going on in eastern and southern Ukraine, because there are enormous distortions of fact and reality. One of the things that's most interesting about the way this whole scenario plays out in the media, which Marilyn mentioned in the introduction earlier, is there are these sudden upsurges of scandal that come and go, and very suspicious. For example, there are photographs released at one point showing Russian troops all over Ukraine. The New York Times had to, quote, walk back that accusation when it proved that that could not be verified, and that most likely these were irregulars, you know, that are part of the upsurge that was going on in this part of the world. Remember the big anti-Semitic leaflet deal that came in, and what was interesting is that when Kerry spoke out on it, he said leaflets of this type, no matter the origin, which of course is a tip-off that these guys either did not know that those leaflets were not part of the arsenal of the Russian propaganda arsenal, or that they deliberately were lying. But in any case, these things have been going on. The worst, probably, victim, the most serious victim, I think, of this kind of playing cavalierly with the truth has been what's going on in eastern and southern Ukraine. Basically, and this is a very interesting thing, Putin, on the one hand, has been, again, probably not wanting to isolate Russia from the major currents of economic and political and strategic life in the world. And after all, Russia has their own oligarchs and their own economic interests and their own fears of grassroots movement that can be threatening to oligarchies wherever they are. So the fact of the matter is that, Putin has talked about moving troops back from the Ukraine border. And even though there are constant allusions to the fact that we don't know for sure, it's pretty clear that there's been some significant removal of troops. There are efforts on his part, recently to say that Russia would honor the May 25th election. In other words, Russia is looking for a roundtable discussion that could bring all the various contending forces together into some kind of general agreement, which has been dragging along. But Russia is not, and this is an important point, Russia is not the Soviet Union. However one may feel about the failures of the Soviet Union, the one thing that they took very seriously when they were in existence was what they called internationalism. Helping the African National Congress with arms, bankrolling Cuba for God knows how many years, and things of that nature. The Russians are not inclined to take on the burdens that would be attached to annexation, for example, of Eastern and South Ukraine, which are industrial areas, but areas that have been laboring under the weight of a global recession with enormous economic and social difficulties. As a matter of fact, one of the progressive Russian analysts pointed out that it's kind of like the mouse that roared, the old movie about going to war against the United States and deliberately losing the war so they get a lot of economic aid. He said, this guy argues that Crimea actually took over Russia because Russia now is responsible for everything from employment to pensions to education to social services and the like in Crimea, which they were not responsible for before. But the fact of the matter is, and I think this is central to this situation and central to our understanding, you may have in this part of Ukraine, in a very tortured, complex political and social history, we all know at this point, it's been